Hello and welcome back to the Late Night Cool Down. I'm your host, Kyle Antoine, and today we are here with Hannah. She is an advocate. Would you call yourself an advocate?
I would say that I'm a concerned citizen.
Concerned citizen. Okay. And today's episode, we're going to be talking about ICBC's no fault policy. I do not know too much about it, so as we go through this episode, we are going to be learning together. Me and the audience. I do have some questions prepared, but I think we'll start off with what is ICBC's no fault policy?
So basically, what makes the policy no fault is that the right of someone to sue the at fault driver in a car accident has been taken away. So if you're injured in a car accident, you have no right to sue at all. And you have no right to sue ICBC as well. If you disagree with what they're saying. So there's no right to sue. And they took away fair compensation for pain and suffering. So before, with the right to sue, you could take the at-fault driver to court and say, you caused me pain and suffering, and I need to be compensated for that. And now that's no longer the case. So those are I would say, the two main attributes of the no fault policy. It's what separates BC from the rest of Canada. No other province has such a horrid setup for insurance. We're by far the worst province with this issue.
And do we know why ICBC decided to create this policy?
Yeah, so they have a long history of budget mismanagement and running deficits, and they were essentially going bankrupt. And so with this policy, their aim is to pay people out as little as possible. It's obviously not in their best interest to properly compensate you. So what David Eby and the NDP government came up with was this policy, and they pushed for the province to go through with this. And the only people that it benefits are ICBC, this monopoly insurance company, and bad drivers. Because now, if you're a bad driver and you cause an accident, ICBC treats the situation as if it was no one's fault. So you're entitled to the same benefits as the person you injured. So if you're texting, you're not looking, and you cause a car accident, your insurance premium will go up a little bit. But as for other consequences, there are none. What this policy does is there's really no incentive for people to drive properly. And it's really scary for pedestrians and cyclists, who are the most vulnerable people on the road, because if they're not being protected by the insurance policy, you could be a pedestrian paying attention, being safe, and then someone else is carelessly driving and you're hit, and you're not allowed to sue them. And you're not going to be able to fight for fair compensation. And not a lot of people know about this policy until it happens to them. Because I had no idea until I was hit by a car as a pedestrian, and my injury wasn't catastrophic or permanently impairing, but I was unable to work for 2 months, or for over 2 months, but I spent the first 2 months in crutches, and I assumed, like everybody else, that I would receive compensation for my injuries and the trauma and the pain and suffering that I went through. And I assumed that I would have the right to sue, because I had video evidence, like someone gave me their dash cam footage. I clearly had evidence that I was in the right of way. And yet I felt as if I had no justice when the ICBC adjuster told me that they took away pain and suffering compensation, and that what I would receive instead was pre-approved benefits, so like physiotherapy. They approve you physiotherapy, massage therapy, kinesiology. They have pre-approved benefits for chiropractors, acupuncture, whatever. And they will reimburse 90% of your lost wages after the first week of your injury. So what this actually looks like is not only did I receive no compensation for my injury, I lost 10% of my income and also a week's worth of wages in the first week that I was injured. So when you look at the whole picture, I was an innocent party and I was paying attention and someone else was not looking, and yet I'm the one losing out. I'm the one who is paying for it with my finances and with daily life stuff, and the person who hit me, there's no consequences for them besides maybe their insurance premium goes up a bit. Like, I will say that my injury is definitely not as serious as the horror stories that I've heard about this policy. Because what happened to me, I was like, I want to do a bit more research about this. Like, this seems super unfair. This seems like I kind of couldn't believe that this was the policy of BC. And looking more into it, there are just the most egregious, like, spine-chilling stories of people who were injured way worse and who have been screwed over by ICBC like 10,000 times more than me. And what's sinister about this policy is that the people who it affects the most are people who are injured and they're fighting for their lives and their health and they're fighting an insurance company. How are you gonna then, like, if no one else knows about this policy, it's the people who are affected who are the ones who have to advocate and tell everybody about this. But the people who found out the hard way are the people who are the most vulnerable. I think it's really important that anyone who's had an experience with no fault needs to be talking about it and educating people, because it's really scary that this could happen to any citizen who lives in this province.
If you got injured in a different province like Ontario or Alberta, what would have been different?
So I'm not an expert at all in terms of what the situation is with other provinces, but I do know that there are provinces who have some variations of no fault, but not completely. Like, from my understanding is in Ontario, they have some cases they treat as no fault, but for extreme cases, you still have the right to sue. And so we're also unique in that our province, ICBC, is a monopoly. So you have no choice but to go to ICBC. They're the only option in this province, and that's not the case for other provinces. Other provinces have private insurance and insurance that competes with each other. So it gives them more of an incentive to treat cases with more fairness, whereas ICBC is the judge, jury, executioner, whatever they say goes in BC. And I do know that in Alberta, they're trying to bring no fault to Alberta, and they're trying to replicate what we have in BC in Alberta. And I think that there's a whole community out there who's fighting it right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It seems like the only people who benefit from no fault is the government and the insurer.
Mm-hmm.
I just looked up some information. So BC's no fault, Quebec is no fault, Manitoba is no fault, Saskatchewan is a choice system, Ontario is a hybrid threshold, and the Alberta and Atlantic, fault-based. You can sue, but financial payouts for minor injuries are capped. And then I also pulled up some stories of people who have been impacted by the no-fault insurance. So Annie Kong in 2022 was one of the two people killed when a vehicle careened into a wedding celebration in West Vancouver. The driver faced no criminal charges, receiving only a $2,000 fine for careless driving under the Motor Vehicle Act. Because the driver wasn't criminally convicted, the no-fault system stripped the family of their legal right to sue for wrongful death or pain and suffering. Just days after the no-fault policy launched in 2021, Scott Shepherd was walking down a North Vancouver sidewalk when a vehicle jumped the curb, launching him into a garden and knocking him unconscious. He suffered a traumatic brain injury and permanent ankle damage that ended his career as a professional golf instructor. Under no-fault legislation, accident victims are barred from hiring a legal advocate or lawyer to fight their case. And then the case of Richard Broad, a working artist from Nanaimo, was stopped in traffic when he was violently rear-ended. The impact caused a posterior vitreous detachment in his left eye, leaving him with permanent distorted vision that directly compromised his ability to paint and generate an income. BC, Quebec, and Manitoba are the only 3 provinces that use a pure no-fault model for bodily injuries. In these provinces, the government-run utility acts as the investigator, the evaluator of your injury, the claim payer, and the final judge. Critics argue this creates a monopoly on justice where the victim has no external advocate. So, what would be the goal? Would it just be to overturn the no-fault policy?
What I would like to see is for true reform of this policy. So what that would look like is bringing back the right to sue, and also bringing back compensation for pain and suffering. And those are the 2 main issues with how insurance is run in BC. But there are so many parts of this policy that are discriminatory. And one of them that there's several, but in terms of wage loss, there were people that I spoke to because I had a display up at the in Robson Square, and I displayed a lot of the stories that you mentioned, the stories about Richard Broad, and I just was displaying several news stories of people who've been affected by this policy. And I spoke to people who, because they worked non-traditional jobs, they weren't properly compensated for their wage loss. And I experienced a bit of that because I was working in the hospitality industry before I was hit by the car, and they didn't seem to understand that tips were a part of a hospitality worker's salary. So I looked at what they calculated as my gross yearly estimated income, and they lowballed it. Like, it's not an accurate representation of what I actually would have been making with tips. I spoke to several people who had experiences with working, if they're a freelance artist or they're a contract worker or gig worker. ICBC will really fight you on that and say that you're actually entitled to less money than is true. So there needs to be fair protection and compensation for workers who are working non-traditional jobs. And as well, in terms of the compensation for wage loss, they cap it at $100,000. You could say like, oh, maybe that sounds reasonable, but it's not reasonable if, for example, you are the only earner in your household. What if your $100,000 was the money for the entire household? So they cap it at that amount, and you're entitled to 90% of it. So you're losing, as I said, you're losing 10% of your income. But I spoke to people who were working non-traditional jobs and were screwed over by ICBC with that, and people who their salary was over the wage cap, and so they lost a lot of their money. And so that's one huge issue with their policy. And another being is there's no recourse for if you disagree with what ICBC says. If you have a problem with what they decide for you, you can't sue them. You can't hire a lawyer and take it up in court because they've moved this court process into something called the Civil Resolution Tribunal. And basically, it is just a kangaroo court. It's an online informal tribunal, and it doesn't abide by any of the rules of the Supreme Court. So it's really up to them to decide what evidence is permissible, and they disproportionately side with ICBC because it's a bit of a conflict of interest. They're also hired by the province. And so in 2020, if I'm remembering this correctly, they sided with ICBC 97% of the time. And the story, that the headline you read about Richard Broad, ICBC told him, because he suffered a vision impairment where everything that was white he saw as pink, and he's a visual artist, so this is clearly a big problem, and he had a pink blob obstructing his vision, and that to anybody is a permanent impairment, a permanent vision impairment. But because he could still see the same distance and closeness, they said that it didn't count as a vision impairment. And so he took this up with the Civil Resolution Tribunal, and big surprise, they sided with ICBC, basically saying, it really sucks that your vision is pink and you have a pink blob in your eye, but we still agree with them, and your compensation is $0 within no fault, and taking away the fundamental right to sue and the right to fair compensation. There are several more issues with how injured people and people who are disabled from car accidents, there's huge issues with how they're being treated at every step of the way. I mean, everything, like we would be sitting here for 5 hours if we went through everything. And yeah, everything that I'm saying, like, it really just scratches the surface, because I found out about this just only months ago, and there are people who've been fighting with ICBC for 5 years. And so, yeah, really, all of these stories, they really just scratch the surface, which is what I learned when I was out in Robson Square with my display. I had so many people walk by telling me things that I didn't know about the policy, and every day my understanding of it was, wow, like, this is worse than I thought.
Do we know if there's any medical professionals who are currently looking over cases to have an input on ICBC's decision or on this tribunal, or are these just council members?
I'm not actually sure, like, the exact people who make up the Civil Resolution Tribunal. They have what they call independent medical examiners. And this is another big problem about this policy, is that when these independent examiners are hired and contracted by ICBC, well, disproportionately what we are seeing is that they are being used to undermine claimants' injuries. And so the pattern is that, because ICBC can order these examinations, so their purpose is to try and pay you out as little as possible. So when they're hiring these medical professionals to go over your injury, it's in their interest to undermine your claim and to undermine your injuries. And these doctors who are hired by ICBC, it doesn't suit them to believe in chronic pain or soft tissue trauma. They're going to look at things like bone fractures and things that you could see clearly in an x-ray. If you're saying I experienced chronic pain or I have neurological damage, maybe I look okay, but after having a conversation, I have to sit down and be in my bed because I have no energy, and I wasn't like this before the accident. It's not in their interest to believe you. So the outcome of a lot of these examinations is telling claimants that their injuries are minor. And this is a pattern that keeps repeating. And under this policy, they classify basically 90% of injuries, they're going to classify as minor injuries. So what they are telling you is a minor injury could be like psychological impairment, neurological damage, nerve nerve damage, chronic pain, things that will affect your day-to-day life. And I don't think any of us would consider that minor.
No. It seems the province has a very black and white solution for something that's not black and white at all. Because, well, before I get into that, the Civil Resolution Tribunal does not operate like a traditional courtroom with a physical judge and jury because it is an independent online administrative tribunal. Its structure is heavily bureaucratic and divided into specific operational roles. Tribunal members, these are the expert decision makers who act as the final arbiters of a case. If a dispute cannot be resolved collaboratively, a single tribunal member is assigned to review the argument and evidence, writing a final decision that can be enforced just like a court order. Unlike standard bureaucrats, members are typically required to hold a law degree, possess 3 to 4 years of specialized legal expertise in areas matching the CRT's jurisdiction, and demonstrate a deep understanding of procedural fairness. They are officially appointed by the BC provincial government via an order in council for standard 3-year terms. Their tribunal intentionally recruits full-time and part-time members from diverse backgrounds, including Indigenous communities, and the overarching governance of the tribunal is steered by an executive team that manages legal, quality control, operational rule. And so we don't even have the right in BC to sue these people.
No. Like, if you have a problem with what they're saying at the Civil Resolution Tribunal, you can take it up in a judicial review and have the court basically review the result. But it's at their discretion to take up your case, so it's not guaranteed that you could have a judicial review. And also, this whole process is extremely expensive. If you're disputing the result of what ICBC is telling you with the Civil Resolution Tribunal, it could be out of your wallet, and it might not even be worth it to dispute it.
This sounds almost inhumane, the way that they first have it so you can't sue the person who injured you, and then you can't sue the people who it's at their total discretion. And then if you want to take it to an actual court and you have your own lawyer, you can take it to a review.
So with the lawyer thing, because you can't take your case up to court anymore, lawyers actually won't really be involved in this process, which is another problem. Is you're gonna have claimants who are injured and in pain self-representing themselves throughout this whole process. So they're the ones directly contacting ICBC at the start of the claims process, and then if they don't like what ICBC says, it's on them to take it up to the Civil Resolution Tribunal and do their own research and represent themselves. Yeah, I think that the Trial Lawyers Association of BC described this whole process like David versus Goliath, but if David had a concussion and no slingshot. And I think that that's a really accurate painting of what this whole process looks like. Because of this policy, it's not viable to hire a lawyer. They're of no use, actually, besides like words of affirmation.
Because in court, that's where you can have nuance, you can describe, you can show, evidence, and actually have kind of a human-like conversation in the courtroom. Whereas if it's just on a phone, it completely strips away all of the humanity from the injured, from the claimant, and it just seems very predatory. It almost seems malicious on the government and ICBC's. The whole point of having an insurance company, if I'm not mistaken, is to have assurance that you're not going to end up on the streets or go hungry when something unpredictable happens. I feel like that's the whole point of having insurance. It doesn't make sense to me, which is why I was very eager to have you on and to kind of explain what it's like to actually go through this. How do you feel about the fact that the city of Vancouver worked with the province and the federal government to spend almost $1 billion hosting FIFA for 4 weeks, but we're capped. If I were to get injured right now by somebody in an accident, I'd be capped at 100,000. Our government seemed to kind of be more inclined to put on a show rather than to help the citizens that are actually suffering in this country.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I think that part of my interest in trying to speak out against this policy is that I was just so shocked at doing research into this and reading these stories that I almost couldn't believe. I almost couldn't believe that it was true. It is really devastating to learn that there are so many people who are vulnerable left behind by this policy, and it's just so sinister that not a lot of people know that this policy even exists. And yeah, like all the headlines that you read, I mean, these are real people, and they've been failed by our government. And it's something that in doing more research about this and in doing more work to try and get this story out there is yeah, every day I'm like, it's just so beyond. There's just honestly no words for this policy existing. I think that we all, as citizens of this province, need to have a lot of empathy for each other and the empathy for people affected, because really it could happen to you, and it takes 1 second to be hit by a car or to be in a car accident. And, there's only so much you can do if you're a pedestrian or if there's a car that's flying towards you. It could happen to anybody. And, yeah, like, what is it worth to save a couple bucks on insurance? What is it worth that ICBC is saving like $1 billion on paying people out? It's not worth the hundreds of people who are really suffering at the hands of this policy. Yeah.
A couple things.
Yeah.
The first one is it's very commendable that when you found out about something this massive and at times very complex, that not allowing. I'm sure you felt overwhelmed learning about all of this information, and I think that's purposely designed that way, because it's just so much information, and secondly, it's our tax dollars that they're holding. I don't see why. Like, I come from the position that if my tax dollars can go to somebody and improve their quality of life, I'm all for it. And
Yeah.
I just have a handful more incidences. This one's from June, or actually in September 2022, 51-year-old Holly Park was run over and killed by an SUV driven by a man she was dating in Surrey. Because of a lack of evidence to prove criminal intent, the driver was never criminally charged. Instead, he was handed a maximum $2,000 fine under the Provincial Motor Act, which I think you kind of committed a crime if you run over somebody and kill them. That's insane. In 2022, Christine O'Reilly's husband was riding his motorcycle on Highway 1 when he was struck and killed by a loose load that detached from a semi-truck. Under the pre-2021 tort system, a surviving spouse could sue the commercial trucking company for massive negligence and long-term financial loss. Under the no-fault rules, lawsuits against at-fault drivers or companies are banned. O'Reilly was forced to accept a minimal capped administrative payout determined strictly by ICBC's standardized tables. So it seems that the common theme with all of these stories is that it puts people who are working, well, essentially, I don't like to segregate based on income, but it seems like the government and big business ultimately get the benefit of this no fault policy where people who oftentimes are struggling, or at least now they're struggling to, keep a house and food on the table, are the ones that are kind of getting the short end of the stick. And this one is Jess Holland Roy was driving his truck when another vehicle turned left directly in front of him, causing a violent collision. Holland Roy survived but suffered a broken C2 vertebrae in his neck, a broken sternum, and a severe concussion. Upon being discharged from the hospital, there was no structured care plan in place from ICBC. His occupational therapist explicitly stated he required an electric lift recliner chair rental so he could sit up and stand without straining his broken neck vertebrae. ICBC's adjusters initially refused to pay for the rental, forcing the medical specialist to wage a bureaucratic battle against the corporation to get the denial reversed. Because external care coordination was delayed, his wife, Beth Mann, had to take an extended medical leave from her teaching job and exhausted her banked sick days to provide round-the-clock care. She described the process as an exhausting battle against an organization showing a distinct lack of compassion and communication. And I'll read just one more. In April 2025, a deadly vehicle ramming incident occurred at Vancouver's Lapu Lapu Festival, leaving multiple people dead and several others critically injured. Legal experts and the Trial Lawyers Association of BC pointed out that the victims and surviving families faced a devastating financial reality. Under the Family Compensation Act, regulations apply to car accidents within the no-fault framework. Families cannot sue for the immense trauma of losing loved ones in a public space. They are restricted entirely to fixed death and wage benefits. Legal analysis confirmed that the compensation provided to these festival victims under the no-fault grids is roughly 3 to 4 times less than what victims would have received under the previous system. Furthermore, to even attempt a lawsuit for pain and suffering, the families have to wait years for a full criminal conviction. If the driver has no personal assets at the end of that multi-year trial, the families get nothing extra, completely insulating the insurer from comprehensive accountability. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
So, are you hopeful that this will change?
I hope that, yes, I hope that it will change. I think that it has to change. I think that, I don't think that this, clearly, this is not a sustainable policy. And I think that it will be a shame if more people have to go through this policy for the government to act. I think that there shouldn't be anybody else who experiences no fault. I will say I'm hopeful for the upcoming amendment to the Insurance Vehicle Act. There is an amendment being introduced, Bill M237, and it will extend the timeline to claim benefits if you're in a catastrophic injury. So you'll have more time to claim benefits. And they are reducing the number of amputations needed to qualify as a catastrophic injury. So right now it's super ridiculous. It's super ridiculous that 2 amputations is what it takes for your injury to be qualified as catastrophic. So basically, according to ICBC, if you're injured in an accident and you've lost your leg up to your hip and you need your leg, you need a prosthetic a prosthetic leg because you've lost your limb, that is not considered catastrophic, according to them. And
I don't know what is.
yeah, I'm not sure there is a single person, a single normal person, honestly, that you can find that has an argument against that. And so right now, you're able to submit, there's only a day and a half to submit, but you can submit your support for the bill. At the Legislative Assembly of BC, they have a portal where you can submit your support for it. And I just said, I support the upcoming bill, and I support the timeline being extended for injured claimants, and I support that one amputation is a catastrophic injury. And honestly, it's insulting and absurd that even has to be said. And the whole thing is insulting and absurd, that this is how slowly the change is happening. They have to introduce this bill to change this tiny detail when what eventually needs to happen is for no fault to no longer exist. This policy has to be abolished. But I am hopeful for this bill, and yeah, I think that this bill needs to go. And yeah, there's people who are determined to see this through. This should no longer exist in BC.
Mm-hmm. And we'll start wrapping things up pretty quick, but it's very sad that the people who are extremely, extremely affected by this no-fault policy can't, I'm going to make an assumption here, but most of them probably can't even stand up for themselves. I did not mean like that, but they can't stick up for themselves, and they can't voice, and especially if you have a traumatic brain injury, that makes, everything in your life incredibly difficult. And, the people who are, who are going to be the most impacted by this are the ones who can't even voice it.
Yeah, well, like I said earlier, like the people who are most impacted by this are people who are fighting for their lives, their health, and an insurance company, and advocating to the rest of the public about the existence of this policy. Like, that is just so much of a burden. And I really would like to see people who know about this policy, who know about it just because they saw it in the news, or they have a friend who experienced no fault. We need the general public to be in solidarity, because this could happen to anyone at any second. And it shouldn't have to happen to all of us to say this is wrong. I think that we know this is wrong. Logically, it's wrong. It doesn't make any sense at all. And we need to hold empathy and solidarity for people who this is affecting the most. Yeah.
Awesome. Is there anything that you want to say before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think that if you've listened to the end and are wondering what to do about it, what to do next, there's a petition on change.org called "End ICBC's No Fault, Protect the Victim, Not the Insurer." It's currently at 2,860 signatures, and you can add your name on change.org. Um, um, and you can write to your MLA. If you Google No to No Fault, there's a website made by the Trial Lawyers Association of BC, and on the Take Action button, you can input your name and address, and it sends an automatic letter to your MLA. And those are two really good resources for starting off and taking action. There's also, there's on the No to No Fault website, there's tons of news stories that you can see, look at. And there's also a book called What ICBC Doesn't Want You to Know. And if you email Wes Musio, he'll send it to you for free. He worked as a lawyer for decades in personal injury.
We'll put everything up on the screen as well.
Okay, great. And if you're on TikTok, if you look up ICBC Claims Diary, there's a woman who makes videos about her story, and it's really egregious. It will have you shaking with rage. But those are some good resources if you want to get more involved and want to learn more about what's happening in this province.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on and taking time to come on to the Late Night Cool Down. I really appreciate it. You've been an amazing guest, been very accommodating for me. Is there any, I typically ask, is there anything you want to promote personally, or do you have a product or anything? But probably not on this episode.
No, I am promoting all the resources that I said, but I've nothing of myself. Yeah.
All right, awesome. Well, this has been the Late Night Cool Down. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. All right.